Aloha! Thank you for joining us here at truthmadeeasy.com as we continue with our Apologetics Made Easy video training course. This is the second of our two bonus videos on evolution. It's entitled Darwin's Theory of Evolution, Part 2, Other Life Forms. Let's quickly review a few of the key points from video 1 and the first life, since what we'll be covering here in this second video builds somewhat upon what we learned in our last video. As we did learn, the theory of evolution became very popular from the work and contribution of this man, Charles Darwin, and his famous book, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, written back in 1859. Many today who believe in this theory of evolution are called Darwinists. Now here again is a snapshot overview of the theory of evolution and natural selection. As we learned, Darwinists believed that all life forms descended from a common ancestor, what is known as the first life. It was a natural process with no intelligent guidance. We're told that these life forms then underwent slow, gradual changes over a long period of time. An important part of Darwinism is the concept of survival of the fittest, where the strongest, quickest, and healthiest survive, and the weakest, slowest, and unhealthiest do not. This process is known as natural selection. In our last video, we broke down our study of evolution into two main phases, as we see here on the screen. Phase 1 is the very first life. Phase 2 is all other life. Evolutionists, as we have seen, teach that the very first life here on planet Earth resulted from what they call spontaneous generation from non-living chemicals. This supposedly occurred in a warm little pond somewhere on the very early Earth. Once there was no life, and then poof, there was life. Nature, natural laws, we're told, created this first life all by itself with no intelligent intervention. God was not involved. Now, for illustration purposes, we'll move all of this over here to the left side so we can label this process first life and phase 1. Again, the first of two phases. And from this simple one-cell creature, we're told, came all the other forms of biological life. This here is a mock-up of the hypothetical evolutionary tree that I put together for illustration purposes. Now we'll put this evolutionary tree over here on the right side together with the ape to man progression, and we've labeled it, as you can see, other life. Again, a key point that we brought up last time was that if there is no phase 1 there on the left, there's no phase 2 or other life. You can't have life forms evolving if you don't have pre-existing life to start with. Without the first life, there's nothing. So now that we have a good understanding from our last video on the first life, let's shift our attention now to natural selection and all other life. Now, a key to our understanding of Darwinism is knowing the difference between what is known as macro and microevolution. To simplify things, I will occasionally use circles, triangles, and rectangles to help illustrate certain concepts of Darwinism. Now it's time to visit some bacteria to help better understand the difference between this concept of macro and microevolution. The theory of evolution involves change and survival. We're told by some that if you want to see evolution at work on a small scale, observe what happens to bacteria when it comes in contact with an antibiotic. We'll let this first box here, labeled 1, represent some bacteria, and then we'll introduce some antibiotics. What happens? Well, here's our second box, where we see the antibiotics go to work and begin killing off the sensitive bacteria. But not all. Some bacteria, which I have colored blue, have the genetic ability to resist the antibiotics and survive. Here we have what Darwin would term survival of the fittest. Now we shift to box 3 and we see the surviving bacteria not only survive, but they begin to multiply. So what have we seen here? Well, we started in box 1 with one kind of bacteria and ended up in box 3 with a different kind of bacteria. They have changed, or as some put it, the bacteria have evolved. And you know what? They're right. The bacteria have evolved. A change took place. But, and this is very, very important for you to understand, even though the changes took place, the bacteria remain bacteria. They didn't change into some other type or organism. What has taken place here is what is known as microevolution. Now, there's another type of evolution that is very different, and it's called macroevolution. Let's take a look at some slides now to show you the important differences between these two types of evolution. The theory of evolution teaches that living things have evolved or changed over time, starting with that first one-cell creature, and over time we got the trees, snakes, fish, birds, and all the other life forms, including apes and the great ape, us humans. We call these slight, successive, gradual changes over a long period of time macroevolution. Now, let's take a moment and illustrate macroevolution using some shapes, okay? With macroevolution, circles change or evolve over a long period of time and eventually become triangles. Triangles then change or evolve over a long period of time to another type and eventually become rectangles. Another technical term you'll hear from time to time being used to describe this macroevolution is the word gradualism. It represents things changing over time gradually. So there you have it, macroevolution, which is changes across types. So looking at macro and microevolution together, you can think of macro as going from left to right with gradual changes across types, and microevolution as up and down with changes within types. I also like to think of macro as resulting in big changes, with microevolution resulting in small changes. Now, with this understanding of macro versus microevolution, let's revisit our bacteria slide. Now, based on what we have just learned, what type of evolution took place with the bacteria here? Was it macro or microevolution? This would be an example of microevolution. Now let's shift gear and move from bacteria and talk a little bit about dogs and genetic limits. We're going to learn a little bit from the Chihuahua and the Great Dane here. Dog breeders today are able to produce different types of dogs through crossbreeding. The resulting dogs can range from the tiny Chihuahua here to the Great Dane. But these breeders aren't able to genetically produce a cat, a cow, or a gorilla from a dog. The reason they can't is that there appears to be genetic barriers, genetic limits built into the dogs. Just like the bacteria example we looked at, this is another example of microevolution, a change within a type. No matter what breeders do, dogs still remain dogs. Isn't it interesting how bright, intelligent breeders with today's technology are unable to make new types of animals? Yet we're told that unintelligent natural laws, through the process of natural selection, were able to create all kinds of many diverse forms of biological life that we see today. How is that? Well, next, let's talk about finches and cyclical change. Just like bacteria and dogs, where we see changes within types, there is also evidence that the famous Darwin finches of the Galapagos Islands experience change within types, a cyclical type of change. During long periods of dry weather, there were more finches that survived with large beaks than finches with small beaks. Apparently, the larger beaks helped crack the larger, harder seeds that they ate, and they were better able to survive. Then, during long periods of wet weather, it was the opposite. There were more small beak finches than large beak finches when the seeds were smaller and softer. More of the small beak finches survived. These changes were cyclical, cycling back and forth depending on the weather. But you'll notice that even though the beak sizes changed, the finches remained finches. Norman Geisler and Frank Turk sum it up nicely in their book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, with this quote: "Natural selection may explain the survival of a species, but not the arrival of a species." You know what? They're right about that. Think about it. Where did the finches come from in the first place? What evidence is there for their arrival by means of evolution and natural selection? So we see that the varying sizes of finch beaks, the different types of dogs, and the changing bacteria are all the result of microevolution. We see no macroevolution taking place. Yet according to Darwin's natural selection, all life forms originated from the same ancestor, that first one-cell amoeba-like creature, through small, successive, gradual changes. So we've seen that all these changes are micro changes. What about the macro changes? What evidence is there for macroevolution and the supposed changes that occurred across types, like the circles evolving into the triangle and the triangle evolving into the rectangle? As we know, the theory of evolution teaches that over a long period of time, through small, successive, gradual changes, the fish evolved into the amphibian, and the amphibian later evolved into the reptile, which in turn evolved into the bird. Is there evidence for this? Exactly how did these creatures supposedly survive during these periods of slow changes when they were in between, let's say, a reptile and a bird? Well, let's look at this further as we visit the reptile and the bird and talk about the non-viability of transitional forms. Now, don't be put off by this technical sounding title. As we'll see, the concept is actually very easy to understand. Natural selection teaches that the reptile gradually evolved into the bird over a long period of time. If this is true, then halfway through the change, there should have been some kind of what I like to think of as an in-between. A creature that was sort of a half reptile, half bird. And if such an in-between really existed, the question is, how did it survive? How could a half reptile, half bird, an in-between creature survive during the transition as its scales were changing into feathers? Halfway through the process, the creature would have two partially formed feathers and would be unable to fly, and its scales would no longer fully protect its body as it did before. So this in-between part reptile, part bird would have trouble flying away from trouble and protecting itself. And it would also have trouble hunting for food. And if such a creature did exist in the distant past, how come we don't find fossils of these in-between half reptile, half bird creatures? Well, speaking of the fossil record, let's look further into the question of where are the in-betweens. Again, back to our macroevolution model using shapes to represent the different types of creatures. We talked in our last set of slides about the reptile evolving into the bird and that there should have been some in-between creature during the transition period. By the way, the term used to describe these in-betweens are intermediates or transitional forms. Let's talk more about these in-betweens using our circle, triangle, and rectangle diagram. First, we'll shrink these shapes down a little bit. Now, if the circle here was evolving into a triangle, we should expect to see an in-between shape that looks like this light green shape here on the bottom left. A sort of half circle, half triangle shape, right? That makes sense. And with the triangle evolving into the rectangle, we should also expect to see an in-between that looks something like this. A light green right triangle shape there on the right. Now think about this. When these creatures died way back in the distant past, they should have left behind circle, triangle, and rectangle fossils, as well as half circle, half triangle, and half triangle, half rectangle in between fossils, right? But when the archaeologists do their digs today and look for the ancient fossils, what do they find? Well, they do find the circle, triangle, and rectangle fossils, but they do not find the in-between intermediate fossils. They're nowhere to be found. And that's the point. The intermediate fossils are missing. And this is not just now with present-day archaeological digs. Even back at the time when Charles Darwin himself lived, they couldn't find the intermediate fossils. Charles Darwin made a very interesting comment about these missing in-betweens, or what he called intermediate links. As he puts it, why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? These would be the green shapes there on the bottom. Geology assuredly does not reveal any finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. Do you see the problem here with the fossil record? Even Charles Darwin himself saw the problem with the missing fossils, the missing intermediates, or what we've been calling the in-betweens. Norman Geisler and Frank Turek comment on this. Darwin thought that further fossil discoveries would reveal that his theory was true. Time has proven him wrong. Contrary to what you may hear in the general media, the fossil record has turned out to be a complete embarrassment for Darwinists. If Darwinism were true, we would have found thousands, if not millions, of transitional fossils by now. They comment further. All animal groups appear separately, fully formed, and at the same time. That's not evidence of gradual evolution, but of instantaneous creation. So the Darwinian tree we are so used to seeing doesn't properly illustrate the real fossil record. Now let me add our diagram of the circle, triangle, and rectangle here at the bottom to illustrate this point about the fossil finds that are fully formed, what Geisler and Turek were just describing. Note that each of the shapes here are fully formed. There are no partial circles, no partial triangles or rectangles, and there are no in-between shapes, no intermediates. In a lecture Norm Geisler gave on fossils, apes, and man, he made this very important point. You can take all of the so-called transitional fossils between apes and man and put them in one large trunk. So we are not talking about masses of fossil finds. There are no proofs anywhere that there is any transitional fossils. Another question that I've had myself for many years is, what about all them skulls that we hear so much about? Perhaps you've wondered the same thing. This issue of skulls came up in a debate that Norman Geisler had some years ago. As he shares in the book, a number of years ago, I, Norm, debated a Darwinist who lined up skulls on a table to illustrate that evolution had occurred. Ladies and gentlemen, right here is the evidence for evolution, he declared. Gee, how can you ignore the fossils? The skulls look like they're in a progression. They look as if they could be ancestrally related. Is this good evidence for Darwinism? No. It's not any better than the evidence that the large kettle evolved from the teaspoon. He continues, the problem for the Darwinists is that the fossil record cannot establish ancestral relationships. Why not? Because according to Michael Denton, 99% of the biology of any organism resides in its soft anatomy, which is inaccessible in a fossil. In other words, it's extremely difficult to discover the biological makeup of a creature by looking at its fossil remains. This goes along with the old saying, you can't judge a book by its cover. Just as you can't judge a book by its cover, you can't judge fossils, skulls, and skeleton discoveries just by looking at the bones themselves. You need to study what's on the inside of the creature. When we look at just the fossils, the skulls and skeletons, we're only looking at the cover of the book. And when we do, we find out that the skulls and skeletons, well, they tell us very little. We need to probe further by looking inside the book, inside the creature's soft anatomy, to study its DNA and genetic code. And when we do, we'll discover that biology tells us a lot. Along this line, Jonathan Wells is quoted as saying, the fossil evidence is open to many interpretations because individual specimens can be reconstructed in a variety of ways, and because the fossil record cannot establish ancestor-descendant relationships. Norman Geisler and Frank Turek comment further. Darwinists take the 1% that fossils tell them, and then use the other 99% of leeway to depict their fossil discoveries as filling any gap they want. With such leeway, and no facts to constrain them, Darwinists have been free to creatively build entire missing links from fossil remains as trivial as a single tooth. This is why so many missing links have later been exposed as frauds or mistakes. Well, now it's time to talk about ape and man and their similar skeletal structures. Now, you have to admit that there is some similarity in appearance and skeletal structure of apes and man, and they both have the ability to walk on 2 feet. From this, many conclude that we're ancestrally related, that man has evolved to become the great ape. But as we've already learned, we need to look beyond just the cover of the book and the skeletal structure. We need to see what's inside the book, what's inside the cells of living things. Now, when it comes to the soft anatomy in biology, some studies show that there is an 85 to over 95% similarity between the DNA of man and the ape. So the conclusion for many is that this proves that we're all ancestrally related, that we all have a common ancestor, that one-celled first life. But what's interesting is that some studies show that there is also a 90% similarity between the DNA of man and mice. Is this really proof of common ancestry? Or is it proof of a common creator? We have to remember that we're all living in the same general environment, the same biosphere, so we can expect to see similarities. Even though we hear about how similar man is to the ape, why is it that we don't hear much about how dissimilar we humans are from all other life forms? What about all those dissimilarities? Why are humans so different from snakes, mold, trees, bats, roaches, horses, and frogs, and all the other creatures that we see here in our hypothetical evolutionary tree? After all, we all supposedly came from that same one-celled creature, right? Well, so far we've looked at 4 of the 6 major weaknesses of evolution. We've looked at genetic limits with the Great Dane and Chihuahua. We've also talked about the cyclical change and the finchbeaks. We also talked about the non-viability of transitional forms, the transition of the reptile to bird, scales to feathers, and also the missing fossil record and the missing in-betweens. Well, as we continue on, we're going to learn more about the final 2 weaknesses of Darwinism. To do so, we're going to take a journey inside the cell, to cell world. As I mentioned in a prior video, when Charles Darwin formulated his theory of evolution, he couldn't see inside the cell like we can today. He was working with primitive microscopes. As a result, the cell was a mysterious world, a black box. Darwin had no idea just how complex the cell was. Since the 1950s, though, our knowledge of the cell has exploded. Now, the cell is small. A typical cell from you or me is probably about the size of 1/10 of a pinhead. Now, with something that small, it's no wonder that our bodies contain trillions of cells and make millions of new cells. And inside each of these cells, there are some amazing things going on. Now, up to this point, we've been looking at natural selection mostly from the outside. From the outside of the Great Dane, Chihuahua, finches, fossils, fishes, amphibians, and reptiles. Now it's time to look to the inside of living things at the cellular level. With today's microscopes and advanced technology, scientists are discovering just how complex the cell is. By the way, this figure is just an illustration, a representation of a cell. It's not a real one. I figured you knew that already, but just in case. Now, we've been using these different shapes here to simplify our understanding of Darwinism and the different species evolving from the circles to triangles to rectangles. Now let's do the same using the same shapes, but this time we'll look inside. Just as the shapes, the species they represent, are different on the outside, we see here that they're very different on the inside, represented by the red, green, and blue lines. Continuing this thought about the differences between the types on the inside, we move to our next topic, a very important one, called molecular isolation, different protein sequences, where we're going to talk about proteins and DNA. We've already learned a little bit about DNA, haven't we, in prior videos, where we discovered that just as English has a 26-letter alphabet, A, B, C, D, and so on, DNA contains 4 letters, A, T, C, and G, that make up the 4-letter DNA alphabet. Now here we have a set of encyclopedias, and here as we open one of the volumes, we find a blank page that we'll use to illustrate the point that just as the English alphabet can be used to communicate a message and fill books using sentences, paragraphs, and chapters, the DNA language, like English, can contain a message and fill a book. Now let's take a look at a couple of messages here. This is message number 1. I love my God more than anything in the world. And this here is message 2. I love my dog more than anything in the world. What do you notice there? Well, you'll see that these two messages contain the exact same letters. And they're also in virtually the same order. They're 95% the same. You will also notice that I've highlighted letters in both messages. By simply flipping those two letters, the letters G and the letter D, we get two very, very different messages, don't we? Well, in the same way, by changing the order of just a few DNA letters, like we see here in message 1 and message 2, well, it can result in very different messages. Now, please understand that this is just an illustration. I'm not saying that by changing just these two letters, A and G, that we'll see this much variation amongst creatures. Just that the small changes in the order of DNA can result in big differences. Again, we have here our basic shapes, the circle, triangle, and rectangle. And here we have our fish, amphibian, and reptile. Now, even though they may share similar DNA, deep inside their cells, the proteins, or what biochemists call protein sequences, are arranged differently. The protein sequences inside the fish are different than the protein sequences inside the amphibian, which are different from the reptile. These are, as a scientist might describe, in molecular isolation. But why? Why is there molecular isolation? If each came from a common ancestor, that same first life, one-celled creature, they should have similar protein sequences, not different ones. To simplify the differences in protein sequences for the fish, amphibian, and reptile, let's use red, green, and blue colored lines here. And let's shrink down the shapes here. Earlier we explained that if Darwinism was true, we should find in-between creatures, transitional intermediates, as they went through slow, gradual changes to their physical structure. Now at the cellular level, on the inside, we should also expect to see the same thing. Slow, gradual changes where there is a blending or sharing of similar proteins. Using our colors, we should see in-between intermediate creatures that have a mix of red and green, as the proteins evolve from the red circle to the green triangle. Same with the evolution from the green triangle to the blue rectangle. There should be in-betweens with a mix of green and blue. But we don't find the blended colored in-betweens because they don't exist. Instead, at the cellular level, we find distinct molecular gaps, with the types in molecular isolation from one another. The proteins in the fish and the proteins in the amphibian are in molecular isolation. They are very different from each other. Same with the amphibian and reptile. They too are in molecular isolation. With that, we'll move to our next section, entitled Irreducible Complexity, the sixth and final weakness of Darwinism that we'll be looking at. We're going to be talking about molecular machines. As we're about to discover, within the microscopic world of the cell, there exist tiny molecular machines that are busy at work keeping living things operating. This man here, biochemist Michael Behe, a former Darwinist turned creationist, has done some excellent research on the cell and irreducible complexity and written a very important book called Darwin's Black Box. As Norman Geisler and Frank Turek point out, Behe's research verifies that living things are literally filled with molecular machines that perform the numerous functions of life. These machines are irreducibly complex. They then go on to quote Behe's description of an irreducibly complex system. We read, "An irreducibly complex system is composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning." And they add, "The irreducible complexity in living things is mind-boggling. Recall that DNA's genetic alphabet consists of 4 letters, A, T, C, and G. Well, within each human cell, there are 3 million pairs of those letters. Not only does your body have trillions of cells and make millions of new cells every second, but each cell is irreducibly complex and contains irreducibly complex subsystems. Now we're going to take a look at an example of something that is irreducibly complex. A car engine is a good example. For an engine to work, as Norman Geisler and Frank Turek point out in the book, all the parts have to be in just the right places, in the right sizes, and in operating order at the same time. A change in one part of an engine requires the simultaneous changing of other parts. If we change just one thing, the pistons for example, the engine will not work. Not until there are changes made to the camshaft, block, cooling system, engine compartment, and other parts. Now, if a technician were to change one part in your car engine, we'll use this diamond shape here to represent that part, and the technician was to make it larger, the motor would stop running until the other related dependent parts were also modified. The circle part would have to be modified, the star part would have to be modified, and so on. As the heading reads up top, a motor doesn't keep running if it's modified piece by piece over a long period of time. And the bottom caption, to keep the car running, all the parts need to be modified at the same time. Even the best technician would be unable to keep your car running and on the road while he or she was in the process of changing and modifying the different parts at the same time. To make the necessary changes, the engine would have to cease operating. The car would need to go into the shop, and so you would lose the use of your wheels for a while as your car is no longer operational. In the same way, molecular machines within living things would not be operational as their parts were constantly being modified from one type to another, from fish to, say, amphibians, and amphibians to reptiles. During the many necessary changes, the machines would cease to function. Using the analogy of your car, living things would be in the shop and non-operational while the modifications were taking place. But this doesn't make sense. For life to continue uninterrupted, according to Darwinism, for living things to evolve, these engines can't be in the shop for repairs. They need to keep running non-stop or evolution doesn't occur. Another thing, Darwinism teaches that all the changes in living things resulted from natural laws at work. There was no intelligent guidance involved. There was no God. And so we ask ourselves, if a technician with intelligence is needed to modify parts in a car engine, how did nature, with no intelligent guidance at all, modify the parts of molecular machines within the cells of living things, while at the same time keeping all those parts functioning and operational? I like Norman Geisler and Frank Turek's comments here. Darwinism is akin to natural forces, without any intelligent help, producing a running car engine, in other words, an amoeba, and then modifying that irreducibly complex engine into successive intermediate engines until those natural forces finally produce the space shuttle, in other words, a human being. Darwinists can't explain the source of the materials to make an engine, much less how any irreducibly complex engine came to be in the first place. Let's put this in image form for you. Here we have our evolutionary model, and we'll pull out the image of the first life on the one end and place the image of man on the other. As Geisler and Turek have pointed out in their analogy, the evolution of this one-celled creature to man is like natural laws, all by themselves, creating a car engine and then modifying that car engine into a space shuttle while keeping the engine running the whole time. Well, after looking at what we've seen so far in the evidence, maybe you're asking yourself, why do so many people still believe in evolution? For in believing in the theory of evolution and the process of natural selection, one must believe by faith that something came from nothing, that life came from non-life, that intelligence came from non-intelligence, and order came from chaos. It takes a lot of faith to believe all this based on what we have seen in these past two videos. A popular response by Darwinists when confronted with the weaknesses of evolution and natural selection is to talk about time and chance. Give natural laws enough time and chance, they say, and evolution can happen. Well, we've already covered this topic of time and chance on our first video, so I won't get into all the details here, other than to quickly flip through a few slides and summarize what we learned. As Geisler and Turek pointed out, chance is a word that we use to describe mathematical possibilities. It has no power of its own. Chance is nothing. And when we talk about time, we saw that even if we were to give nature and natural laws billions of years to form Mount Rushmore, it would never happen. Time alone cannot create what only intelligence can create. If time and intelligence is required for Mount Rushmore, then time and intelligence is certainly required for the first life, which contains within it the informational equivalent of 1,000 complete sets of encyclopedias. Furthermore, we've learned that it would take about 200 proteins for that first life to come into existence. The odds of that happening by natural laws is virtually impossible when you consider that the odds of just one protein being created by chance is the same as a blindfolded man finding one marked grain of sand in the Sahara Desert 3 times in a row. Yet we are to believe that the first life came from non-life all by itself, when even intelligent scientists today, with super sophisticated equipment, can't do it. Let's shift now to the next topic of just so stories. You might be familiar with this term. It's used by critics of Darwinism to describe Darwinistic responses when they don't have good answers to questions posed by others. To illustrate just so thinking, we'll use a hypothetical story of a lead detective who has just arrived at the scene of a homicide in Waikiki. He hasn't had time to investigate anything yet when he's met by reporters. When asked if they had any suspect, the detective responds, "None yet. We haven't begun our investigation. But we do know this. The crime had to have been committed by a tourist." "How do you know that?" a reporter asks. "Because we've already ruled out Hawaii residents." One reporter presses, "But sir, I thought you just said that the investigation had not yet begun, so how do you know the crime was committed by a tourist?" "Because." "Because what, sir?" "Because it's just so." Now again, this is just a hypothetical example used for illustration purposes. Of course, no police detective would do that. But what can we take away from this illustration? Well, by having just 2 options to choose from and ruling out one option ahead of time, the other option is the only remaining choice. By ruling out Hawaii residents in advance, the only remaining choice is tourists. And why is this? Because it's just so. It had to be a tourist. Now, as silly as this illustration is, this is the point. Many Darwinists do essentially the same thing when it comes to determining the origin of the universe and life. They rule out intelligence as a possible cause before they even begin to investigate. As we learned, there are only 2 possible causes for anything: non-intelligent natural causes and intelligent causes. Now, when Darwinists rule out intelligence and God in advance, before they've even begun their investigation, the only remaining choice is natural laws. When asked why intelligence is ruled out, why natural laws is the only remaining choice, some will respond, because. Because what? Because it's just so. This ruling out of intelligence in advance is similar in many ways to what we discussed earlier when we talked about the topic of worldview glasses. Remember them? When we were studying miracles, we talked about how our worldview, how we each view or see the world, depends on the type of glasses we wear. Our glasses can shape what we see and what we don't see. We can even choose to wear certain glasses that prevent us from seeing things we don't want to see. We then looked at some different worldview glasses, what we called natural and supernatural glasses. Since we're talking about Darwinism and evolution here, let's change out the supernatural glasses for a new pair of intelligent glasses. Now we have 2 sets of glasses here that can detect both types of causes, intelligent and non-intelligent natural causes. Better yet, let's build another set of combination or combo glasses that will give us the best of both worlds. When a person views the world and the things going on around them with only one set of glasses, they're not getting the whole story. They're just getting half the picture. But the person who uses combo glasses and looks for both natural and intelligent causes, they get the full picture, the whole story. Optimum results come from the person who views things this way and follows the evidence wherever it leads. to either a natural or intelligent cause. When a person is looking at, let's say, the origin of the universe with just natural glasses, they see only the universe and the natural world and conclude that there is no supernatural being such as God, and that the cause of the universe must somehow be natural. But the person who wears combo glasses and examines the evidence from all angles and looks for both natural and intelligent causes, well, they're going to come to another conclusion. For as they consider the Big Bang evidence, they will come to the conclusion that the evidence best points to a supernatural first cause beginner of the universe. And as they investigate further, they discover that this intelligent being has the characteristics of those matching the God of the Bible. Same with the origin of life. A person wearing just natural glasses will observe the various life forms here on Earth and look only for a natural explanation for their origin. They may conclude, like many, that the theories for the first life and natural selection make sense to them. But the person wearing the combo glasses, the person who has studied the evidence with an open mind, considering both the natural and intelligent causes, will conclude that living things display clear signs of intelligence that go beyond natural laws. They don't find the evidence matching up with the first life and natural selection, and so they continue on with their search for the cause of the origin of life. As they do, they discover that life contains a message. From their own observations in life, they rightly conclude that only an intelligent being can create such a message in life, one with specified complexity found in the cells of living things. A message such as the one found in the one-celled amoeba-like creature. A message with the informational equivalent of 1,000 complete sets of encyclopedias. And let's not forget about the message found in the human brain. A message with the informational content of 20 million books. From this, the person wearing these combo glasses realizes that only a supremely intelligent being such as God could create the many diverse forms of life on this wonderfully designed planet Earth, a planet that has been designed by the great designer to have just the right conditions to support life. Those 122 anthropic principles that we learned about earlier, that against great odds allow living things to survive on planet Earth, a planet traveling through space at 67,000 miles per hour in the midst of a cold and hostile universe, in much the same way astronauts survive aboard a space shuttle. Only a person wearing glasses that views the world from both a natural and an intelligent perspective will see this. Those lacking this two-dimensional view miss out on so very much that the intelligent creator has intended for them to see. Still others cling to Darwinism because of what's in their heart. It's a heart thing. For them, evolution and Darwin's teachings provide a nice scientific alternative to God, the Bible, and creationism. We've talked about this already. For some, they don't have a lack of knowledge or understanding of what the Bible teaches about creationism. It's not a head thing. For them, it's a heart thing, a matter of the will. Some people just don't want anything to do with God. In a past video, we talked about Friedrich Nietzsche, who has been quoted as saying, if one were to prove this God of the Christians to us, we should be even less able to believe in him. Loosely paraphrased, even if you prove God to me, I'm not going to believe. For the person who, like Nietzsche, wants nothing to do with God, Darwinism is the ideal belief. Or might we say, for some, the ideal religion, a secular religion. Let's talk a little now about science being like a secular religion. When we were talking earlier about naturalists and materialists in an earlier video, we looked at this quote from Norman Geisler and Frank Turek on the topic of science being like a religion. Let's read it again. Spontaneous generation of life, which Darwinism requires to get the theory started, has never been observed. It is believed in by faith. The Darwinian belief in naturalism or materialism is also an article of faith. Hence, Darwinism is nothing more than a secular religion masquerading as science. On the subject of science, Geisler and Turek also include a quote by Richard Lewontin. Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, because we have a prior commitment to materialism, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. So it's understandable why some continue to hold on to Darwinism and other scientific claims despite the absurdity of its ideas and theories, for they cannot allow God's divine foot in the door. God must stay out. Let's take a look at one last group of people here that continue to believe in Darwinistic evolution, those who are unaware of its weaknesses and flaws. Earlier we mentioned Michael Behe when we were discussing Irreducible Complexity and his extraordinary work regarding molecular machines that operate within the cell. Behe, a biochemist, is one very, very intelligent scientist, a former Darwinist turned creationist. While studying his own branch of science, Behe just assumed that Darwinistic evolution was the best explanation. However, as time went on, he began to discover that some of the things in the evolutionary model just didn't add up. In time, he reached the conclusion that Darwinistic evolution could not be true, that the evidence can be better explained by creationism and intelligent design. Behe represents many other scientists out there, good, intelligent, hardworking men and women who just aren't aware of some of the weaknesses with Darwinism. Their field of study may not directly focus on things related to the origin of life and so on. Or they may have questions on one thing or another, but they just assume that these questions can best be explained by others who specialize in another branch of science other than theirs. Then there are the many students in school who are also unaware of the flaws of Darwinism. These are students who learned evolution in school and have believed it ever since. They think it must be true because my teacher taught it, and they've never thought twice about it. Now, as surprising as it may seem, without even looking at the scientific evidence we've covered in these last two videos, we could have determined that Darwinism and natural selection was false based on the 5 points we've covered in this Apologetics Made Easy course. How's that, you ask? Well, if you've been following along with our other videos, you already know why. If not, let me explain. As we went through each of these 5 points here in our 5-point hand illustration, point 1, God exists, 2, miracles are possible, 3, the New Testament is a good history book, 4, Jesus is God, and 5, the Bible is the Word of God, and proved that each of these points were true beyond a reasonable doubt, we concluded that 1, Christianity was the one true religion, and 2, whatever the Bible teaches is true. And then, by applying what we learned early on in the course about truth, that the opposite of true is false, we arrived at the logical conclusion that any teaching that differs from the true Bible is false. So based on what we've learned about Darwinistic evolution, we know that its teachings significantly differ from the Bible. The Bible teaches on the very first page in Genesis 1:1 that God created the heavens and the earth. And in subsequent passages, we learn that God also created all living things. Darwinism, on the other hand, teaches that the first life on earth generated spontaneously from non-living chemicals, and from that first one-cell creature evolved all other biological life through the process of natural selection. And God had no part in it. Since the Bible is true, and any teaching that differs from it is false, there can be only one conclusion. Darwinism is false. It's really that simple. Still, I hope you realize that these studies on evolution can be of great value to you for a number of reasons. Number 1, you have a better understanding now of the weaknesses of Darwinism, and it can only strengthen your confidence in the biblical account of creationism. And 2, you're now better prepared to intelligently share what you've learned with others. What you'll discover oftentimes is that people may say they believe in evolution, but when you ask them why, many have difficulty explaining why they believe it. Some do, but many do not. If someone you know or someone you meet tells you that they believe in evolution, one easy way to find out if they really understand what evolution teaches is to ask them this simple question. Do you believe in macro or microevolution? Depending on their answer, you can continue to discuss things in more detail and share some of the things you may have learned in these videos or in your other studies. Many of us did study evolution in school, but that was years ago, and we've forgotten a lot of what we learned, and even more importantly, why we believed it. Many just believe because they read it in a book or a teacher told them it was so, or it's the popular thing to say. Because they have not been introduced to the many weaknesses and problems of Darwinism, they have continued to believe in it to this day. Well, as we near the end of this video, let's wrap up our studies on evolution and review a few of the things we've learned. As we've seen in our two videos, the evidence for evolution and natural selection is not very convincing. In this video, we've looked at 6 particular weaknesses or flaws of Darwinistic evolution and natural selection: genetic limits, cyclical change, non-viability of transitional forms, the fossil record, molecular isolation, and irreducible complexity. In addition to each of these, there are also many other questions. For in believing in evolution and the process of natural selection, one must believe by faith that something came from nothing, that life came from non-life, that intelligence came from non-intelligence, and order came from disorder. It takes a lot of faith to believe all of this in light of the evidence, because the evidence is just not there. Early in the course, we talked about faith and the proof glass. We talked about how faith covers a gap in knowledge. Faith covers a gap in the proof or the evidence we have. In making a decision on something, we gather the evidence and proof the best we can, represented by the blue sports drink in the glass. It's very rare that we have absolute 100% proof, evidence that fills the glass completely. For most things in life, there's usually a gap at the top of the glass, that unknown quantity, and that's where faith comes in. As Norman Geisler and Frank Turek point out, faith covers a gap in knowledge. How much faith is needed to fill that gap depends on how much knowledge, evidence, or proof we have. If we have little evidence, lots of faith is needed. On the other hand, if we have lots of evidence, little faith is needed. Based on the evidence Darwinists provide for the origin of the universe and the origin of first life and natural selection, you have to say that their glass best fits the glass on the left. With little evidence, the Darwinist glass needs lots of faith to fill it to the top. I think Norman Geisler and Frank Turek sum it up nicely in their book, the title of which is I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. After pointing out the many problems with Darwinism, they add this statement, which cleverly ties in with the title of the book: it takes too much faith to be a Darwinist. And that's why we don't have enough faith to be Darwinists. I think God's own words here in Isaiah 45:12 nicely answer the question of the origin of the universe and life. We read, "It is I who made the earth and created mankind upon it. My own hand stretched out the heavens. I marshaled their starry hosts." It was God, not natural laws, that created man and all living things. It was God who created the heavens, and it was God who created all living things. The starry heavens are a testimony to his handiwork, for the heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Our God is truly an awesome God. Well, that'll do it for this Apologetics Made Easy video training course. Again, I hope it's been of help to you and that you've picked up a few things along the way. Be sure to check back and visit our Truth Made Easy website from time to time to check out new things we've added to help to make the teachings of Jesus and the Bible easier to understand and learn. Until next time, God bless you and aloha.